I wasn't in a good place that January, and that is the plainest way to say it without dressing it up like a sermon. My name is Cole Holloway. I was 43, and for most of my life I trusted two things: good wire pulled tight and feed measured right. If a gate sagged, you reset the post. If a trough froze, you broke ice and got on with it. If a truck coughed in cold weather, you warmed the block and waited. I understood work, sequence, and repair. Then Ben died in early autumn from a heart attack so fast I still catch myself trying to build a timeline that makes sense of it. He was there, then he wasn't. No warning that meant anything. No gradual easing. Just gone. By the second week of January, I had returned full-time to the mountain edge homestead we built together, and could barely stand being inside it. We had cut our own line through the lower cedar stand for the drive, set the house where dawn would break over Black Ridge, and argued for 2 evenings over whether the porch should face the pasture or the valley. Ben won that one. He said a man should be able to sit with his coffee and see weather coming. He was right, like he usually was on the practical things he pretended not to care much about. Now, the porch faced a long white field and a fence line that ran out toward pines black with frost, and I sat there some mornings with cold coffee gone metallic in the cup, watching weather come and not caring much whether I was ready. I didn't sleep in our bed most nights. I could have, technically. The mattress was still there, quilt folded, his side hollowed from years of him rolling to his left. But every time I lay down and felt that empty stretch of sheet beside me, it felt like stepping through rotten boards. So I started falling asleep in my work chair by the wood stove, boots still on, shoulders tipped forward, waking at 2 or 3 with a cramp in my neck, and that dull panic that comes when you forget where you are for half a breath. I'd stand, poke coals, drink tap water from a jar, and tell myself this was temporary, just a hard season, just winter doing what winter does. I repeated that like a rule. I did not believe in signs. I did not believe in comfort sent from somewhere unseen. I believed in what held under strain. Most days I ate from cans because cooking for one felt like admitting something final. Chili, beans, soup if I had the patience to heat it, slow enough not to scorch. I'd stand at the counter and eat half, then put the rest in the fridge and forget it. The sink collected bowls and spoons in a way that would have gotten me a look from Ben. Not mean, just pointed, eyebrows up, like he was saying, "You seen this mess, Holloway?" I kept expecting that look from the doorway. Instead, there was only the refrigerator hum and the occasional groan in the rafters when wind came off the ridge. The real pressure that winter had a name every person in the valley used: the Black Ridge Freeze. It wasn't one storm and done. It was a run of bitter nights that refused to break, wind that slid under coat seams and took your heat by force, troughs icing over by dawn no matter how late you broke them, hinges stiff as bone, calves balling thin in the dark if you were slow to bed them down. It was the kind of cold that made simple tasks non-trivial. You had to plan each hour around what would fail next. I checked heaters, wrapped exposed pipe, hauled extra hay to the lee side, and walked fences twice a day because frozen ground can lift a post clean enough to make you think somebody pulled it. That was my routine. Not living. Routine. Every morning I woke in the chair or on top of it, reached for the knit cap on the floor, and looked toward the hallway before I could stop myself. Our bedroom door sat half open, and from that angle I could see the corner of the dresser and the framed photo of us at the county fair, sun in our eyes, both of us squinting like we'd never learned what hats were for. I made myself stand there exactly 5 seconds, then turned away. It was a private ritual built out of stubbornness and cowardice both. Face it. Don't stay. Then Red would thump his tail against the stove guard and remind me there was a body in the room besides mine. Red was Ben's old healer mix, muzzle gone grey, one torn ear, patient as a preacher and twice as observant. He moved slower in the cold, but he never missed fence walk. I'd snap his leash to his collar for the first stretch out of habit, then unclip once we reached the lower gate, where he always stayed close anyway. Snow in that valley carried sound farther than summer did. You could hear distant truck chains on the county road, a single board knock in somebody's barn half a mile off, crows lifting from cedar tops like somebody shook out black cloth. Red listened to all of it and only barked when it mattered. My sister, Lila, called most evenings around 6. The ringtone would buzz on the counter while I was scraping mud from my boots or checking weather, and I'd watch her name light up, then fade. Sometimes she left a message. "Cole, pick up if you're there. I don't need a long talk. Just tell me you ate." Another night. "I can come out Saturday. Help with laundry and groceries. Don't make that face, I can hear it through voicemail." And once, quieter. "I know you think staying busy is the same as being okay. It isn't." I listened to each one while staring out the kitchen window at the feed bins, thumb hovering over callback, then slid the phone face down and went outside. It wasn't anger. Lila loved me the best way she knew how. But I had nothing to say that didn't feel like repeating weather reports from inside a well. Cold today, colder tomorrow. Chance of getting through chores. Grief for me wasn't crying all day, and it wasn't dramatic. It was a second weather system pressing down on my chest while I did ordinary tasks. I'd be at the water tank with a maul, raising it to crack 2 inches of ice, and halfway through the swing, I'd forget why my arms felt heavy. I'd be rolling wire and catch the smell of cedar sawdust from the woodpile, and have to stop because Ben used to split cedar with this rhythm that sounded like breathing. I'd open the tack room and see his gloves on the peg where he left them in September, fingers curled inward, and stand there so long, Red nudged my knee twice and sighed. One night, near the end of that second week, the wind dropped for an hour and the house went so quiet I could hear the clock above the stove tick like small taps from a nail set. I sat in the dark, except for stove glow, and had the kind of internal argument a man loses even when he wins. I remember it clear because I said parts of it out loud. I am tired, I thought, and I'm not special in this. Men lose people every day and still feed stock by sunrise. I'm sitting in this chair because the bed is too big and because if I lie on that mattress I can feel exactly where his shoulder used to warm the quilt. I'm telling myself I don't believe in signs because signs would mean I'm waiting for one, and waiting is a helpless thing, and I have built my life around not being helpless. I'm angry at casseroles and kind faces and phrases like, "He's in a better place because none of them break trough ice at 5 in the morning." I am a grown man counting fence staples, and canned goods like numbers can hold a house together. I am still talking to him when I'm outside, one sentence at a time and pretending it's just habit. I am not okay. I'm not falling apart either. I'm just carrying too much in cold weather. Red lifted his head when I spoke, gave me that side-eye dogs use when they're deciding whether to intervene in human foolishness, then got up and put his chin on my thigh. I laughed once, short and rough, because there I was giving a speech to a dog beside a stove in a house I couldn't fill anymore. "Don't start charging by the hour," I told him. "I can't afford a therapist with paws." His tail thumped exactly once. That was his whole reply. The next morning dawn came in blue fog off the low creek, and frost had feathered the porch rail so thick it looked furred. I pulled on Ben's old canvas coat because mine was still damp at the cuffs, checked the thermometer nailed by the mudroom door, and saw a number that made me whistle through my teeth. Black Ridge Freeze still had its hand on us. I filled 2 buckets, broke tank ice, forked hay, checked mineral block, and walked the east fence with Red, trotting close enough to brush my boot whenever I slowed. At the far corner, I stopped and looked out over the valley where the pines dropped into a white fold of land, and the ridge beyond sat dark against a pale sky. No revelation came, no voice from the trees, just cold air, my own breath, and one more day asking to be worked through. I set my glove on the top wire, felt the bite of steel through leather, and kept moving because chores were what I had. And at that point, chores were enough to keep a man upright. Red moved ahead of me along the east wire, shoulders rolling under his winter coat while his breath feathered white in front of his nose. The snow squeaked with each step, that dry, cold sound that meant the temperature had dropped hard overnight, and the post tops wore little caps of frost like somebody had dipped them in sugar. I kept one gloved hand on the top strand as I walked, feeling for slack by touch more than sight, and I counted staples out of habit because numbers still behaved when the rest of life didn't. 9 posts tight, 10th, one leaning half an inch out, note it for afternoon. The routine steadied my legs. It did not steady my head. At the north bend where the ground fell toward the creek, I stopped to catch my breath and hated that I had to. I wasn't old and I wasn't soft, but grief had a way of stealing stamina from places you didn't expect. I could carry a 50-pound feed sack, no problem. I could not stand in one place too long without feeling that hollowed-out drag behind my ribs. The valley spread below me in long, white strips broken by cedar and barbed wire, smoke lifting from one chimney 2 properties over, and Black Ridge sitting dark and stubborn against a washed-out sky. Ben loved this exact view. He used to set his thermos on this exact post and say, "If we ever get foolish enough to move, remind me I said that while looking right here." I stood there with my hand on the post where his hand used to land and felt like a man wearing his own life second-hand. By noon I had thawed the west trough, patched one cracked board on the lee shelter, and wrestled a frozen latch that took a hammer and words I wouldn't repeat in church. I ate, standing up in the barn aisle, cold beans from a can and 2 saltines I found crushed in my coat pocket, while Red sat by the tackroom door and watched like he was judging my standards. "Yeah, I know," I told him. "Chef of the year." He blinked slow and looked away, which felt deserved. Then I laughed once because I had become a man taking culinary criticism from a dog with hay in his whiskers, and if Ben could have seen me, he'd have made a whole speech about proper table manners and plated cuisine on a 5-gallon bucket. The laughter dropped off as quick as it came. The afternoon light went flat and blue, and with it came that familiar pressure, the one that felt less like sadness and more like weather settling into my joints. I checked the carving shed, counted noses twice, then a third time because my mind kept slipping the count. Back at the house, I peeled off wet gloves, set them on the stove rail, and stared too long at the second mug hanging by the sink, the enamel one chipped at the rim that Ben always grabbed first. I reached for it without thinking, then stopped halfway and held my hand there in the air like an idiot. I am tired, I thought. I am not sleeping right, and I am not eating right, and I keep calling it discipline because that sounds cleaner than what it is. I am running this place like a machine and pretending machines do not break. I am angry at daylight for ending and angry at night for coming, and I am angry at the people who call because they care, and angry at myself for not answering. I told myself I could outwork this, that enough fence checks and trough checks and feed checks would wear grief down to something manageable like a rough board sanded smooth. It did not work that way. Grief stayed rough. It sat beside me in the truck seat, stood in doorways, followed me out to the corrals. The only time it eased was when my hands were fully occupied, and even then it waited at the edge, patient as cold. Just after dusk, with the wind beginning to rise again, Lila called and I picked up before I could talk myself out of it. "You alive out there?" she said. "Last I checked. You eat. Beans." "Cole, beans aren't a personality." I rubbed my eyes and leaned against the counter. "Freeze has me running. Pipes, fences, all of it." "I know. I'm not asking you to quit working. I'm asking you to stop disappearing. I can come Saturday with groceries." "You don't need to drive that road in this cold." She was quiet for a beat. "Then let me help in some way you can stand." I looked out the window at my own porch light and swallowed. "Call me tomorrow evening. I'll pick up." "All right," she said softly. "Tomorrow evening." After we hung up, I stood there listening to the line click dead, then set the phone down careful, like it might crack from too much handling. That night, I did one more fence walk with a lantern, because the freeze had a habit of finding the weak spot you missed at noon. Red stayed glued to my left knee. The wind combed through the wire with a thin, singing tone, and somewhere up on the ridge a branch snapped under ice weight and echoed down like a rifle shot. I flinched at it anyway. Not fear, nerves worn thin. I checked the north gate chain twice, came back in with my beard crusted white, and fell asleep in the chair before I finished untying my boots. By dawn the next morning, the cold had sharpened enough that the porch boards rang when I stepped on them. The sky was clear but colourless, and a low fog sat in the creek cut like spilled milk. I set out along the lower fence with Red, and after 10 minutes, I noticed something that made me stop and listen. No crows, no jays, no brush rustle, not even that constant little tick of twigs settling under frost. The valley wasn't silent exactly, but it held itself differently, like all the ordinary noises had taken one step back. Red's ears were up, forward, interested, but his back stayed loose. He wasn't bristled, he wasn't tense, he just listened with me. At the southeast corner, where the wind always shoved snow against the fence until it packed hard as mortar, I found the drift gone, not blown thinner, gone, cleared right down to crust and dirt in a clean curve along 15 feet of wire, wide enough that I could walk it without lifting my knees. I stood there with my hands on my hips and frowned at it, like frowning would explain anything. There were no shovel marks, no blade scrape, no tire track, and no sign of deer digging. Just a clear run where there should have been a wall of packed snow. I walked the edge twice, then a third time, and finally said out loud, "Wind eddy," though I knew every wind on that corner and had never seen one carved like that. Red did not inspect the drift. He trotted 10 yards past me, stopped at the cedar line, and sat. Not a hard sit, just settled in neat, tail laid out on the snow. Then he gave one single thump and kept looking into the trees as if someone was late to an appointment. Usually he growled at shadows, at elk, at my own coat flapping on a nail. That morning, he looked politely expectant. I waited with him for a full minute, maybe 2, feeling faintly foolish. Nothing stepped out, no branch moved. Still, he didn't bark, and he didn't come when I clicked my tongue the first time. On the second call, he rose, came back to my side, and leaned his shoulder against my knee before moving on. I finished chores with my mind snagged on that cleared corner. Around midday, I dug a pocket notebook out of the junk drawer, tore off the feed store receipt tucked in it, and wrote, at the top of a page, "Pranks by Weather." It was a dumb label, and I knew it, but putting words down made me feel less like I was drifting. I wrote the date, the temperature, fence corner cleared, birds quiet, dog calm at Cedar Line. Then I underlined wind eddy twice so my own skepticism had something to hold on to. By evening, the note looked both sensible and ridiculous, which matched the day. 2 nights later, after another round of trough breaking and one blown hinge pin, I came in past dark with my hands aching and found split cedar stacked on my porch in a tight spiral, each piece laid with the cut face turned inward exactly the way Ben used to do when he wanted kindling to dry, fast. Not a toss pile. A pattern. Intentional, careful, almost pretty in the porch light. I set my gloves down on the rail and stared at it until the cold bit through my socks. We were a half-mile from the nearest place. Nobody came up our drive unannounced in January for decorative woodwork. "Lila," I called once into the dark, even though her car would have left tracks. No answer. Red stepped past me, sniffed the spiral, then looked toward the tree line and sat again, tail tapping one measured beat against the boards. He looked the way he had looked at that fence corner, calm and waiting, like someone polite was finishing a task just out of sight. I felt the hair rise on my arms under the coat, not from dread, not from any sense of danger, but from the plain fact that something I could not explain had touched my porch with care. I crouched and lifted one cedar split, fresh, dry, not from my stack. I put it back exactly where it had been, went inside and wrote every detail in the notebook before I could argue myself out of what I'd seen. Then I stood at the kitchen window with the light off, watching the dark edge of trees, while Red kept his post by the door. And for the first time since Ben died, curiosity pried open a narrow space inside the grief. That narrow space stayed open while I watched, and I found myself waiting instead of hiding. From the waiting, the porch light threw a soft yellow wedge across the boards, and beyond that, the yard lay blue-black under crusted snow, fence wire faint as pencil lines against the dark. Red stood from his post, stretched, and walked to the mudroom door, then looked back at me with that steady, practical expression of his. I took that as instruction, grabbed my lantern, and stepped outside. Cold bit hard enough to make my nose sting, but the wind had dropped to almost nothing. Every small sound carried. I heard it then. Weight in snow, slow and deliberate, out near the lower cedar line. Not crashing, not rushing, just a measured crunch, pause, crunch, as if whatever moved out there knew exactly where it placed each step. Red did not bristle, he did not bark. He stood beside my left leg with his ears forward and his tail low but loose. I turned the lantern higher and saw only trunks, shadow, and the white rise of drift. The sound stopped. We stood there together until my fingers started to numb through wool. Then I went back in and shut the door careful. Not because I was scared, but because the quiet felt like something you didn't slam a door against. I slept in the chair again, though sleep is generous for what it was. I drifted, woke, drifted, checked the stove, listened. Once around 3, I heard that same careful rhythm along the far fence, then silence. When dawn came, pale and reluctant, I pulled on my boots and headed out before coffee. Red was waiting at the door before I reached for my coat. The tracks started 20 yards past the porch steps where moonlight had glazed the snow overnight. My own boot prints from last evening crossed toward the woodpile in blunt, familiar blocks. Beside them, and then running outside the fence line for nearly 50 yards, were impressions I had no tidy slot for. Bare, wide, heel and forefoot clear, toes splayed slightly from pressure. Each print sat deep where the crust should have held. The stride was long but not erratic. Whoever or whatever had made them had moved with balance, no sliding, no stumble, no drag, and stayed outside the wire as if respecting boundary by choice. I crouched and laid my glove beside one track. My hand covered maybe half the length. I took the notebook from my coat pocket and wrote with a carpenter pencil because ink froze. Date, time, temp. Track count visible 23. Orientation north to south, outside fence. Depth greater than boot by roughly 2 inches. No claw marks, no sign of pursuit, no circling livestock. Red sniffed one print, sneezed once, and sat down in it like it was a shallow bowl. I laughed out loud despite myself and told him, "If this is your new bed preference, I'm not building one that size." He looked offended for exactly 2 seconds and then licked frost off his nose. By late morning, I'd talked myself through 4 practical explanations and discarded all 4. Oversized novelty tracks made by a bored hunter did not account for depth and stride over half-frozen ground. A bear didn't match the shape. Snow collapse didn't create toe detail. My own mind going soft from grief didn't leave compression in crust. I told myself this couldn't be real, then kept kneeling beside proof my hands could touch. Curiosity did something grief hadn't allowed in months. It moved my attention forward. I checked corners I usually hurried past. I listened for patterns. I started wanting the next clue before I'd even finished chores. The ache in my chest was still there, heavy and familiar. But for stretches of an hour, I wasn't only carrying loss, I was also carrying questions. By the 3rd morning after the cedar spiral appeared, I had added a 2nd page in the notebook and begun drawing little maps of where I found tracks, crossed stones, and once a sprig of wintergreen laid on the top rail near the north gate, fresh enough to smell when I bent close. That one stopped me. Wintergreen didn't grow up by the gate in January. I held the sprig to my nose and got that sharp, clean scent Ben used to tuck into his coat pocket when he was splitting wood. Said it kept him awake better than coffee. I set it back where I found it, exactly perpendicular to the wire, and wrote down the angle like a fool cataloguing weather that arranged itself. That afternoon I drove into town for feed and a new box of staples, partly because I needed them, and partly because I wanted to hear another human voice that wasn't in my voicemail. The feed store smelled like grain dust, diesel and wet canvas. Same as always. Mr. Tully was at the counter in his quilted vest, ringing up salt blocks with his reading glasses halfway down his nose. "You look like January chewed you up," he said without looking up. "January's doing that to everybody." He glanced up then, held my face a second longer than usual. "Red's still walking with you?" "Every line twice if I let him." He nodded toward the window where a light snow had started again. Good dog knows more than we do half the time. I hesitated, then heard myself say, "You ever seen tracks up on Black Ridge that don't match anything sensible?" Mr. Tully's mouth twitched, not a smile exactly. Sensible is a narrow category. What kind? "Bear. Big enough to make my boot look like a kid's." He bagged my invoice in no hurry. "Some things up here mind their business better than people. If it's not hurting stock and your dog's calm, I'd keep your eyes open and your mouth selective." "That your scientific position?" "That's my old man position," he said. "Science can catch up when it wants." I took the receipt and loaded feed in the truck while that sentence settled. Mind their business better than people. It was the most useful advice I'd gotten in months. At 6 that evening, I answered when Lila called like I said I would. "You picked up," she said, surprised and relieved in the same breath. "Don't make a holiday of it." "Too late. I already baked a pie in your honor." "Lila, if this is peach in January, I'm hanging up." "It is not peach. I'm not a magician. How are you for real?" I looked through the kitchen window at the porch spiral, still neat under a dusting of new snow. "Working, sleeping bad, but working." She waited. And I've got odd things out here. Tracks, wood stacked I didn't stack. Her voice softened, careful. "Cole, you're exhausted. Grief can make patterns out of static. That's not you failing. That's your brain trying to hold onto order. I know what a track looks like." "I know you do. I'm saying be kind to yourself while you sort it. I rubbed my thumb along the notebook edge in my pocket. I'm trying. Good. Keep trying. I'll call tomorrow. After we hung up, I stood at the sink and felt the familiar split. One part of me clinging to practical explanations, one part admitting the practical shelf was running out of room. Outside, the first stars came sharp over the ridge, and Red lifted his head from the rug before any sound reached me. 3 days passed with the same pattern deepening. On mornings after those careful nighttime passes, cattle were calmer at the east pasture, bunching less at the windbreak and eating sooner. Twice I found the drift-prone corner cleared again, not blown open in jagged patches, but carved in a smooth, walkable arc. Once I found a rabbit snare at the edge of county land, sprung open and laid flat, wire untwisted with a precision I would have respected in any fence hand. Red sniffed it, then moved on, uninterested in alarm. I wrote each detail down and began carrying a tape measure in my coat like a man running a private survey no one would fund. Moonrise came cold and bright on the night I finally saw him full enough to stop pretending I hadn't. I was at the west fence repairing a sag where frost heave had lifted a post. Lantern hanging from the wire, pliers in my teeth, gloves off for better feel, cursing softly because numb fingers don't tie good knots. Snow reflected silver from the rising moon, enough light to draw shadows from every rail. Red had ranged 10 yards out and then come back twice, restless, but not upset, checking me like he does when I'm taking too long at one task. I finished twisting the splice and straightened my back, hand pressed to my hip. That was when I heard the steps behind and to my right, out past the gate opening. Heavy, yes, but placed with care. No crash, no branch tearing, intentional weight. I turned slow, more from stiffness than caution, and saw a shape 30 yards off at the cedar edge that did not fit any category I had used to organize the world. He stood taller than the gatepost by a clear margin, broad through shoulders and chest, dark fur catching moonlight in dull bands of brown and black. His outline was massive, yet the posture was almost apologetic, shoulders lowered, knees slightly bent, one long arm reaching back to rest a hand against a cedar trunk as if he meant to occupy less space. His head tilted once, not bird-like, just curious. He did not advance. He did not loom. He simply stood where the trees ended and open ground began, leaving me room. Every hair on my neck rose, and still the fear I expected never arrived. Awe came first, then a kind of steadying recognition I can't dress up into cleaner language. I wanted to run and wanted to stay in equal measure, and what kept me still was Red. The old dog walked 2 steps forward, stopped midway between us, and lay down in the snow with his paws crossed, relaxed as if we were waiting on the vet to call our name. He let out a breath I could see in the moonlight, and closed his eyes halfway. That settled it in me. Dogs do not fake trust in conditions that can kill them. I remember my mind talking in plain, stubborn lines while I stood there with frozen fingers and a half-fixed fence. This could not be real, and it was. This was too large, too old in its presence, too deliberate to be panic misfiring in my head. If I moved wrong, maybe it would vanish and leave me arguing with myself for years. If I moved right, maybe nothing happened at all. I knew, somehow, I wasn't in danger. I knew that as surely as I knew when ice would hold a man's weight and when it would crack. So I did the most awkward thing I could have done and nodded at him like we'd met at church supper. "Evening," I said, voice rough from cold and disbelief. He shifted his weight once. Not forward. Back and to the side, a subtle yielding motion you make when giving somebody the right of way at a narrow gate. One hand lifted from the cedar trunk, palm angled down, then rested there again. Fingers long, careful. The same care I'd seen in the wood spiral, in the cleared drifts, in the untwisted snare. My chest tightened so hard it hurt, and for one odd second I nearly apologized for keeping him waiting, which is how I learned grief, and wonder can make a man polite to a 9-foot stranger in the snow. We stayed like that, maybe 30 seconds, maybe 3 minutes. Time did that stretching thing it does only a few times in a life. Moonlight silvered the wire between us. My lantern hissed softly at my elbow. Red thumped his tail once against crust. Then the big figure stepped back into the cedars with a smooth economy that made no sense for his size, each foot placed where branches were thinnest. No snapping, no rush. 2 steps, 3, and he was shape more than body, then shadow among shadows, then gone. The quiet afterward was not empty. It was full, like a room after somebody important has just left it. I went to where he had stood and found prints pressed deep and clean in the moonlit snow, each one broad as a dinner plate and edged sharp. I set my boot beside the nearest track and stared at the difference until my eyes watered from cold. Then I laughed once, shaky and short, because I had just greeted an enormous forest being like a neighbor borrowing tools, and somewhere Ben was probably rolling his eyes at my conversational skills. Red came and leaned hard against my leg, warm and solid through my coveralls. Back at the house, I wrote for nearly an hour without taking off my coat. Distance, posture, hand on cedar, Red lying down, no threat display, retreat pattern. I underlined one line 3 times until the pencil tore paper. Not fear, wonder. When I finally looked up, stove coals had burned low and frost had crawled the lower window pane in fern patterns. Grief was still in the room with me, but it had shifted from a weight, crushing downward, to something I could carry while standing. I fed the stove, checked the latch, and before I sat down, I looked out at the fence line where moonlight lay over snow, and I waited with gratitude instead of dread. I kept standing at the window until my reflection took over the glass and the fence line turned to faint silver threads under the moon. Red had stretched out by the door, but he was not fully asleep. Every few breaths one ear lifted, then settled. I felt that same alertness in my own shoulders. Not panic, just a tension pulled forward by something I could not file away as weather or fatigue. A little after midnight, a soft weight crossed the yard again, that same deliberate rhythm in crusted snow, and this time it came closer than before. I eased the door open and stepped onto the porch with my hands visible and empty, feeling more foolish than brave. The cold hit hard enough to burn my throat. The yard lay still under a thin sheen of moonlight, fence wires pale, cedar shadows long and dark, and at the edge of that shadow line he stood, maybe 20 yards out, broad as a feed shed and quiet as standing timber. He was clearer at that distance, fur long and winter thick along his shoulders, shorter across his forearms and face. Not black, not brown, some mix that caught light and gave it back in muted bands. His chest rose and fell slow. He kept his weight low, knees bent a little, body angled so he did not square up at me like an animal claiming ground. He looked at me directly, then down once, then back up, like he was measuring my nerves and giving me time to find them. I did not know what gesture belonged in that moment, so I did the only one I trusted. I took one step backward from the porch edge and lowered my eyes for a breath, the same way you do around a nervous horse. He shifted too, not retreating far, just easing a half step into deeper shade, matching my choice with one of his own. That small exchange settled me more than anything else had. He was not cornering me. He was reading me. I said quietly. "You can stay out there, I'm just looking." He did not answer with any sound, but he lifted his chin once and lowered it, almost a nod, then remained still. Red came to stand beside me and sat, calm as if waiting on dawn coffee. I almost laughed, and the laugh came out in a short white cloud. I had spent months unable to carry ordinary grief without dropping pieces of myself all over the day, and now I was standing on my porch in old Long John's negotiating porch etiquette with a giant forest neighbour while my dog supervised. Ben would have enjoyed that more than was fair. We stayed like that long enough for my toes to go numb. When I finally turned to go inside, he moved first, taking 3 careful steps back into cedar shadow, making sure distance stayed between us. Not fear, courtesy. The distinction mattered. I slept 2 straight hours after that, which was better than I had done in weeks. At dawn, I followed his tracks from the yard to the east line, notebook in one pocket, tape in the other, and saw how he had walked the outside edge of my fence without crossing once. In 2 places where crust had drifted high against the bottom strand, the snow was tamped down smooth, almost like a path laid by a patient hand. Cattle stood easy in that pasture, heads down and feeding, not bunched in their usual cold weather knot. Red wandered print to print with the kind of interest he gave new hay, then came back and leaned against my leg. I knelt by one clear impression and set my hand in it again. The size still upset my practical sense. The clean pressure points at heel and forefoot upset it more. Grief had made me doubtful of my own thinking these last months. This did the opposite. I could measure this. I could draw it. I could photograph it. Evidence did not fix the world, but it anchored it. By the 4th night after that moonlit porch stand, I had changed my routine without admitting I had changed it. I still fed and checked and repaired on schedule, but I left a little extra time at dusk to sit on the lower gate with Red and watch the cedar edge. Sometimes he appeared, sometimes he did not. On the nights he came, he kept his distance and moved with the same low-shouldered care, never crossing wire, never crowding livestock, never lingering once I went back inside. Twice I found a crossed pair of smooth stones on the top rail by morning. Once, a fresh wintergreen sprig lay near my boot prints at the north post, where Ben used to rest his thermos. I tried hard to keep a rational frame around it, and I did my usual internal argument while scraping ice from a trough one dawn. I am standing in a pasture with a maul in my hand and steam coming off my sleeves, and I'm not interested in fantasies. I know frost heave. I know predator sign. I know what tired minds can do. But I also know when a thing repeats with intent. I know the difference between random and pattern. I know the old dog at my knee who has no reason to pretend calm. I know that whatever walks this fence does not take, does not chase, does not press. It watches. It leaves order where there was disorder. It keeps to the edge like it understands property lines better than some men I have hired. I do not need an explanation before I admit what I am seeing. That same afternoon I drove to town for feed cubes and salt, and I brought the notebook in my jacket even though I told myself I wouldn't show it. Mr. Tully rang me up, then tapped the counter with one finger. "You look less haunted," he said. "Still tired, less haunted." "I'm seeing him more," I said, before I could back off the words. Mr. Tully looked past me toward the window, where sleet had started ticking against the glass. And he keeps his distance like he doesn't want trouble. Leaves little things. Tracks the fence outside, not in. He nodded once, slow. "Then he's telling you what he is." "What's that?" "Neighbourly from what you're saying." I let out a dry breath. "You say that like this happens every winter." He almost smiled. "Not every winter. Just enough that old folks quit acting surprised." When I got home, Lila called on schedule. I answered while cutting twine off a hay bale. "You sound winded," she said. "Moving feed. Are you eating better?" "Made eggs this morning." "That's progress. Any more odd stuff?" I looked through the kitchen window toward the north fence where twilight had turned everything steel blue. "Yes," repeatedly. "But I'm okay." She was quiet a second, then chose her words careful. Okay as in functioning, or okay as in not alone in your head all the time? I leaned on the counter and surprised myself by answering straight. "Second one. Some." "All right," she said softly. "I can live with some." That line stayed with me through the evening chores. Some. Not fixed, not healed clean. Just a little room inside the hurt where breath could move. The next day brought a harder edge of weather. Fine snow came sideways all afternoon. Not a full storm, but enough to hide shallow holes and glass the ditch banks. I worked the north side late because one hinge kept icing shut. Red followed close, then ranged toward the old irrigation cut that ran below the fence and doubled back with water in spring. In winter, it held patchy ice over dark trickles, harmless if you saw it, trouble if you didn't. I heard him yelp once, sharp and surprised. My stomach dropped. Red! He had broken through at a narrow point where snow had bridged the ditch. Not deep enough to drown him, but deep enough that his hindquarters slid and he couldn't get footing on the slick bank. He scrabbled, claws chattering against ice, chest heaving steam. I dropped to my knees at the edge, reached down with both arms and got one hand on his collar, then lost purchase when the crust sheared under my elbow. Cold water soaked through my glove and sleeve in seconds. "Easy, buddy, easy." He whined, not panic, just strain, and tried to climb toward me. I could not lift him clean from that angle without going in after him, and with the bank undercut, I might have pinned both of us. I shifted right for a better stance. Boots sliding, heart pounding so hard it made me light-headed. Then snow crunched behind me with that familiar, measured weight. I turned my head and he was there at the edge of my sight line. Close now, closer than ever, maybe 8 feet away up the bank, huge and utterly steady. He did not rush me. He crouched low, one arm extending slowly, palm open to show intention before movement. I moved back on instinct and because there was no room for both of us at that lip. He took my place in one smooth motion, braced his long legs wide and reached down with both hands toward Red. Red went still. No growl, no flinch, just still. Those big hands closed gentle, one under Red's chest, one supporting his hips, and lifted him clear as careful as a man lifting a sleeping child from a truck seat. No jerk, no squeeze, just strength guided by attention. He set Red on packed snow 3 feet from the edge, then immediately turned and used one forearm to break the thin shelf of brittle ice along the lip so it would not trap a leg again. He pushed the broken pieces down into the ditch, clearing a safe slope with quick, deliberate sweeps, then stepped back and dropped his gaze, giving me the space to go to my dog first. I crawled to Red and ran my hands over him, checking paws, ribs, shoulders. Wet and shivering but sound. He pressed into my chest, then twisted, and looked back toward the big figure with his tail making 2 slow thumps. I looked too. He stood 10 feet away now, broad against the white and grey, snow catching in his fur, breathing calm. Between us on the ground lay a small bundle of dry cedar bark strips and pencil-thin kindling, set there while my back was turned. Dry fuel in this wet cold, exactly what I needed to warm Red before the walk home. It was so practical it broke me more than any mystery could have. "Thank you," I said, voice cracking open around the words. He lifted one hand, palm angled down, the same quiet gesture I had seen at the tree line, then backed away 3 long steps. He watched until I got a small fire going in the lee of a post with that bark and kindling, watched until Red stopped shivering so hard, and only then turned toward the cedars. He moved uphill with that impossible combination of size and care, placing each foot where the crust held, leaving a line of deep prints that curved along the outside fence and disappeared into trees. I sat in the snow beside that little fire with Red leaning into me, both of us steaming in the cold, and cried without fighting it. Not loud, not dramatic, just a release I had postponed since the funeral, because there was always one more chore and one more reason to keep my jaw set. I cried because my dog was warm against my leg. I cried because something vast and unexplainable had treated us with more gentleness than I had given myself in months. I cried because kindness had found my fence line and kept showing up like it had nowhere else it needed to be. By full dark, we were back at the house. I toweled Red dry by the stove, checked him again, fed him early, and finally made real food for myself instead of opening a can. Eggs and toast and fried potatoes with too much salt, standing at the counter while the kitchen windows fogged. I wrote everything down afterward, every motion I could remember, then circled one sentence until the pencil dulled. Deliberate kindness, aimed at what I love. Before bed, I stepped onto the porch one last time. The stormlight had gone thin and silver over the pasture. At the north post, just beyond the reach of my porch lamp, a fresh cedar spiral sat neat on the rail. Split faces turned inward exactly the way Ben used to teach me. I set my hand on the top wire, breathed the cold air deep, and left the porch lantern burning, not as a warning, but as a welcome. I stood there with my hand on the wire and the porch lantern burning behind me, listening to the quiet settle over the pasture in slow layers. Wind moved high in the ridge cedars, but down in the yard it was still enough that I could hear Red drinking from his bowl through the open mudroom door. My face was stiff from cold and dried tears, and the skin around my eyes felt raw. But I did not go inside. I kept looking toward the north fence where Ben used to stop at dusk, one boot heel hooked on the bottom strand, thermos in hand, like he had all evening to stand there and think. Snow held a pale light, not moon-bright, just enough to shape fence posts and drift edges. Then a darker shape separated from the cedar line and came forward until it stood at that exact stretch of wire, outside the fence, shoulders low, hands open at his sides. He stayed there and watched me, not demanding anything, not asking me to prove I understood. The distance between us was maybe 30 feet, but the space felt close in a way that had nothing to do with steps. Red came to the porch, paused with one paw lifted, then walked down and sat by my right leg, leaning lightly against my shin. I drew one breath, then another, and felt my chest hitch on the third. There are moments when you can feel your own stubbornness loosening, like a knot in wet rope, and that was one of them. I had spent months keeping my jaw set, speaking in tasks, counting posts, counting bales, counting days since the funeral like numbers might hold me upright. None of it had touched the locked place in me. Standing there in the cold with that great quiet figure at the fence, the lock gave way. "Thank you," I said again, louder this time, voice rough and unsteady. "For Red, for the wood, for all of it." He tilted his head once, the same small movement I had seen at moonrise, and lowered his gaze for a beat. Not submission. Respect. It landed in me harder than I was ready for. I looked past him to the trees and said the words I had refused to form with anyone listening. "Ben, I'm still here. I'm cold and tired and mad half the time, but I'm still here, you hear me? I fed them all. I kept the lines tight. I kept Red warm. I'm still doing it. The sentence broke in the middle and came back in pieces. I miss you every hour, not some hours, every hour. I cried into my gloves, shoulders shaking in those short, ugly pulls that make breathing feel like work. Red pressed harder against my leg and stayed there, solid and patient. I told myself this couldn't be real in the old, reflexive way, then watched my own breath stream white while he stood under drifting snow at my fence, calm as old timber, and I let the argument die where it stood. Grief had been a second weather system on my chest for so long that I had mistaken pressure for structure. Out there with him watching and waiting, it changed shape. It did not vanish. It moved. It made room for air. I talked until words ran out. Some of it was to Ben, some of it to the dark, some of it just sound finally leaving a body that had held too much. You used to say winter tells you what your place is made of, I said, wiping my face with my sleeve. I thought that meant boards and wire and hay under tarps. Maybe it also means what a man does when nobody can explain why he was helped. He did not move closer. He did not step away. Snow gathered along his forearms and shoulders, and every so often he shifted his weight with care, like he was making sure the ground under him did not break crust too loudly. When my crying eased to ragged breathing, he lifted one hand, palm angled down in that same quiet signal, then rested it lightly on the top rail from his side. By the time the stove settled to coals after midnight, I had gone inside and come back out with Ben's old wool blanket around my shoulders and a thermos of hot water cradled in both hands. He was still there at the north stretch, a little farther back now, broad outlines softened by thin snowfall. I stepped down from the porch and walked halfway to the fence, boots squeaking in cold powder, then stopped and set the thermos cap in the snow. Steam curled up in a faint ribbon. I don't know if this is foolish, I said, half laughing through a cracked voice. I have had stranger nights lately. I poured hot water into the cap and set it on the top board of the inside brace post. Nowhere near his reach across the wire, just an offering without presumption. He watched, then looked at the cap, then at me. He did not come to it. That also felt right. We were not pets and keepers, not tamed and tameable. We were two living things at a boundary, both honoring it. I stood there long enough for my fingers to ache, then carried the thermos back and sat on the porch step with Red curled against my hip. An hour later, when cloud cover thinned and a hard strip of stars opened over Black Ridge, he turned in place with that same deliberate economy and began walking the outside fence toward the east corner. No drama, no backward glance meant to be remembered. Just steady placement of each foot where crust would hold, long arms hanging loose, shoulders rolling gently under winter fur. He paused once at the drift-prone bend, tamped down a high lip of snow with two careful presses of his hands, and moved on. I got to my feet and followed from the yard side at a respectful distance, lantern low, Red pacing between us and the wire. We tracked him for a quarter-mile like that, 3 figures keeping parallel lines through blue night. At the old cottonwood post, he stopped and crouched. For a second I thought he had found a snag in the bottom strand, but he reached into the snow instead and brought up a length of wind-thrown cedar limb wedged against the fence. He snapped it into manageable pieces with controlled pressure, no wasted force, then stacked them on my side by nudging each piece under the lower wire with the back of his fingers so they slid through without snagging barbs. Practical, useful, done with the same neat attention as the porch spirals. I knelt and gathered the pieces, set them in a tidy pile, and felt another wave of that strange gratitude that kept arriving like tidewater. He rose, watched until I stood, then gave that small downward palm motion once more. Got it, I said quietly. I see it. He resumed his line east, reached the cedar break near the county boundary, and angled into the trees. Snow-laden branches shifted around his shoulders and settled again. I could follow the prints for maybe 20 yards by lantern light, each track deep and clear. Then they merged with roots and shadow and were gone. The forest did not close behind him in any theatrical way. It simply continued being forest. Red stood at the edge, tail low, ears forward, and made a soft huff through his nose like a goodbye he understood better than I did. We went back to the house slow. I carried the cedar pieces against my chest, Red brushing my knee every few steps, and the cold no longer felt like punishment. Inside, I dried my boots, fed the stove, and opened the notebook to a clean page. I wrote until my hand cramped, every detail I could hold. Posture, gestures, the way he kept outside wire, the way he withdrew without asking to be followed. Then I added a line beneath the measurements and underlined it once. Kindness does not always announce itself. Sometimes it works your fence and leaves before dawn. I closed the notebook, set it in the top drawer by the phone instead of my coat pocket, and lay down in our bed for the first time since October. Sleep came in uneven stretches, but it came. I woke at grey dawn to Red's chin on the mattress and the smell of cedar from the mudroom. My neck ached less than usual. My chest still hurt, yet it was a hurt with edges, not that endless pressure cloud. Outside, the fence line held in clean white arcs, and the north corner was tamped and walkable where drifts usually walled me out. I made coffee, burned the first piece of toast, made another, and ate both at the table instead of standing at the counter. Then I called Lila before chores. She answered on the second ring. "Cole, you okay?" "Yeah," I said, and heard the steadiness in my own voice. "I'm okay, tired, but okay." She exhaled hard, almost a laugh. "You called me first. Mark the calendar." "Don't make it weird." "I'm absolutely making it weird. You eat?" "Toast and coffee. Better than beans." I looked out toward the east fence where only wind and cattle moved now. "Lila, I'm not ready to explain all of it, but I'm not disappearing today." "That's enough," she said. "That's more than enough." After we hung up, I pulled on my coat and stepped into the cold morning. Red trotted ahead toward the lower gate. At the north post, untouched by any fresh track, sat the cedar spiral from last night, still neat, split faces turned inward. I left it there, took the fence pliers from their hook, and started my walk with gratitude, pacing beside me, quiet as snowfall. The morning had a different shape to it, not warm, not easy, but less clenched. Wind still moved along Black Ridge, yet down in the valley the hard bite had eased to something a man could work inside without feeling flayed open. At the north gate I stopped and looked down. Beside my fresh boot print sat one broad track, sharp-edged in the crust, heel deep, toes clear. Next to both was a small cedar spiral, tighter than a dinner plate, split faces turned inward. I crouched and set my hand beside the print one last time. Then I did what I should have done earlier if I wanted my practical mind fully on board. I went back for the old digital camera from the junk drawer, took photos from 3 angles, measured length and width with my tape, and wrote numbers in the notebook before thawing my fingers at the stove. By noon, I had photographed the tamped drift corners, the stacked cedar by the porch, the crossed stones at the east rail, and the wintergreen sprig I found tucked near the gate brace. I had already flattened the freed snare wire and hung it in the tack room as a reminder. That afternoon I carried it to the scrap barrel and noted in the notebook, "Snare removed from line. No replacement found." 3 days passed before I saw him again, and by then, the freeze had broken clean. The thermometer climbed above what we'd called survival range. Trough ice cracked thin by itself at noon. Cattle spread out to feed instead of bunching in panic at the windbreak, and every head counted where it should. I repaired the north panel properly, reset 2 posts and slept 4 full hours in bed without waking in the chair with my boots on. Progress looked ordinary from the road. To me, it felt like being allowed back into my own life. On Saturday, Lila's truck came up the drive with groceries rattling in milk crates and a pie balanced on a towel on the passenger seat. She stepped out in a red knit hat, took one look at me, and narrowed her eyes. "You shaved," she said. "Don't make a federal case. You answered your phone all week, too. I'm putting both in the family record." She carried in bags while I cleared counter space. Red followed her like she was a parade. We moved around each other in that practiced sibling way. Shoulder turns and half steps. No collisions even in a small kitchen. She unpacked eggs, stew meat, potatoes, coffee, then set both palms on the counter and looked at me straight. "Talk to me plain." So I did. Not every line from the notebook, not every detail of posture and gesture, but enough. Tracks, wood spirals, red in the ditch. The kindling left dry in wet cold. Him staying outside the fence every time. I expected the careful concern face she used when she thought I was slipping. Instead, she listened without interrupting, eyes steady, mouth set like she was sorting facts by weight. When I finished, she let out a slow breath. "I don't know what category to put that in, Cole." "Same. I'm not going to call you overtired this time. You're too specific." She glanced toward the porch where the cedar spiral still sat by the rail. "Do you want me to see your notebook?" I brought it from the top drawer and set it in front of her. She turned pages for a long minute, reading dates, temperatures, measurements, little maps and arrows. At one photo, she stopped. My boot beside that broad print at the gate. "That's not a prank," she said quietly. "No." She closed the notebook with both hands, as if closing something respectful. "Do you want me to tell anybody?" "No, just you. And Mr. Tully already knows enough to not act surprised." She nodded once. "Then it stays with us." We ate beef stew at the table that evening. Real bowls, bread warmed in the oven, pie after. She washed while I dried, and when she left, she hugged me hard by the mudroom door, cheek cold from outside air. "You sound like yourself again," she said into my shoulder. "I don't feel like the old self." "Good," she said. "Maybe keep the parts that are kinder." By the second week of February, I drove to the feed store with the notebook on the passenger seat and asked Mr. Tully if he had 10 minutes. He poured coffee from a stained thermos into 2 paper cups and led me to the seed room where the heater rattled and nobody bothered us. I set the notebook down. I took notes, photos too. "I'm not asking you to certify anything. I just want to know if I'm alone in this." He read in silence for a while, one finger tracking lines. At the photo of the porch spiral, he gave me that look older men give when a memory arrives before they're ready. Then he sat back. "My dad saw a sign like this in 78 up above Miller Cut," he said. "No harm done. Stock karma, odd little arrangements, tracks after hard nights. He told me one rule: don't chase, don't bait, don't brag. Mind the boundary if it minds yours." Did he ever see him clear? Once, at dusk, said he felt watched over, not watched for. He tapped the notebook cover. "You did right writing it down. Keeps you honest with yourself." I wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "What do I do with all this now?" "Live better," he said. "That's enough outcome for one man." I considered reporting tracks to somebody official, and I even dialed the county office one afternoon with the phone in my hand and the notebook open. Then I set the phone down without pressing call. Evidence like mine would become spectacle in a week and litter by spring. I wrote one final entry on that question. No submission. Reason: protect place, protect livestock, protect boundary. That settled it more than any committee would have. The strange details did not vanish. They simply found their place. The crossed stones stayed on the east rail until thaw. Then I moved them to the porch post where rain wouldn't split them. The wintergreen sprigs came twice more and then stopped with the warmer nights. The drift corners stayed mostly clear during the last 2 storms, whether by wind pattern or help I could not prove. I kept checking anyway. Red kept sitting at the cedar line some evenings, tail thumping once, then returning when I called, satisfied. I also cleaned the house. Not a dramatic montage, just one room at a time with a rag, a trash bag, and the radio low. I cleared the sink, changed bedding, mended a torn curtain, and finally moved Ben's gloves from the tack room peg to the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, because leaving them in the doorway hurt in a way that no longer honored him. I still talked to him while I worked. I'm still here, Ben. Fence is holding. Red stole half a biscuit this morning and looked innocent while chewing. I burned the first pancake and ate it anyway because you are not here to complain about my heat control. I miss you in present tense and past tense both. But I can stand in this kitchen now without feeling like the floor dropped out. Late one clear evening, after chores and before full dark, I saw him one final time. He stood far up the east line where cedar meets open pasture, maybe 60 yards out, turned partly toward me. No approach, no new sign to decode, just presence. I raised my hand. He held still for a breath, then gave the small, downward palm gesture that had come to mean ease, and stepped back into trees. He did not return after that. Red watched the spot, sighed, and nudged my knee as if to say, "Shift's over." The last of the Black Ridge freeze gave way by the first week of March. Mud replaced crust. Water ran in the ditch where Red had slipped, and I cut a cleaner channel with a shovel so no dog or calf would get caught there again. I stacked a week's wood by the porch in a spiral, and then in a regular row beside it, both methods side by side. Old habit meeting new gratitude. The notebook stayed in the top drawer wrapped in a feed store sack to keep dust off. I did not hide it. I did not display it. Now I walk the fence at dusk most days, whether it needs me or not. Sometimes Lila calls while I'm out there, and I answer, breathless from the hill, and tell her what the sky looks like over Black Ridge. Sometimes Mr. Tully asks, casual as weather, "Lines holding?" And I say, "They are." That is true in more than one direction. What changed was non-trivial and plain at once. I still believe in wire pulled tight and feed measured right. I still trust mended hinges over speeches, but I no longer confuse skepticism with strength. The world did not become smaller because I couldn't explain one part of it. It became larger and kinder, and that gave me room to keep going without hardening all the way through. I keep the cedar spiral on the porch rail year-round, even in rain. Each evening I set my hand on the top wire at the north post where Ben used to stand. Red warm against my leg, and I give thanks to what I can name and what I can't. Then head back to the house before full dark, steady and unafraid.